to fully appreciate the Easter story means that we have to go back to the beginning of Jesus' story. And some of you might be thinking, Bethlehem, manger. But no, the story begins before then. We're going all the way back to Eden with Adam and Eve and that critical act of rebellion, which was really a rejection of God as their guiding light. And the moment it happened, their robes of glory faded. Genesis chapter 3, verse 7 details this moment as described by their eyes being opened. But I have to wonder if that's really the first sensation that they experienced. Can you imagine what it might be like to feel goosebumps for the very first time as the chill of the air hits your skin? But more than physically, you sense deep within your soul something has shifted, something is wrong. That joy, that peace, that love that's hard to describe unless you know the opposite is being replaced by feelings of dread, of terror, of frailty, a nakedness of the soul. Adam and Eve tried to cover their guilt and shame, but wilt and wither are not in their vocabulary yet. These are foreign concepts to them who have had no reference for what death and decay mean. But they're about to confront quite tangibly the consequences of the curse, the fact that the wages of sin equals death. And more than physically trying to shield themselves, emotionally, they're also trying to put up walls, casting blame upon each other, upon the circumstances, upon the snake, even upon God. But our attempts to solve problems are usually not too successful. We wear fig leaves every time we attempt to be self-sufficient in resolving our shame. Any means of escaping pain, any drug of choice is just fig leaves. Eventually, they wither, they wilt, they lose their effectiveness. The Old Testament prophet Isaiah does a callback to this Eden moment when he confronts self-righteousness that all humanity experiences, stating all of us have become like the one who is unclean, and all of our righteous deeds are but like filthy garments. All of us wither like a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind will take us away. But thank goodness that the story doesn't end with the problem. There is a stand-in sacrifice. As we continue to read Genesis chapter 3, it specifies that after some discourse with Adam and Eve, God acts. It's the Lord God himself who made garments of skin for Adam and his wife to clothe them. In this passage, in this one sentence, is laid the groundwork for the pattern of salvation history. That God would take a sacrificial animal, likely a lamb, and before Adam and Eve, before their witness, before their horror, to take the life of that animal so that its outer fur could wrap around their naked bodies. You see, when Revelation speaks about the lamb that was slain, it's not a callback to the Exodus wilderness tabernacle. The lamb that was slain before the foundations of the world is speaking about this promised Messiah. It's speaking about this Genesis illustration that Jesus would do the very thing that animal experienced it, give up its life for the sake of others. The wool tunic that the Lord clothed Adam and Eve in would represent a righteousness by extension through Jesus' death as an innocent substitute. And God in this moment shows us that he himself is one with us in the death and in the dying. He doesn't make Adam kill the lamb, but he himself takes the skin and wraps it. And unlike the fig leaf that just covered their private parts, their loins, this fur coat would go head to toe, shoulders to ankles, revealing the completeness of God's covering. God meets you where you are, but he doesn't leave you to wear your fig leaves. He's got a fur coat waiting instead, but he doesn't stop there because the fur coat itself is just a foreshadowing, a hint of the robe of righteousness that will eventually come. And to this, the prophet Isaiah completes the story, saying, I will rejoice greatly in the Lord. My soul will exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation, and he has wrapped me in a robe of righteousness. This is the living hope. This is what gets you through the times where the chill seeps deep into your soul. The Hebrew word for garment or coat of skin actually signifies the same word used as the high priest's tunic. So it's a long garment, and it is sufficient to cover the entire body. The fig leaves to fur coat upgrade was a pretty powerful metaphor. But there is more to be found as we look at the garments of Jesus, particularly in those final days, in those final hours. If you want to turn with me to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, you'll find in verse 17 a reference to this. Matthew also records this detail, and you can find that in Matthew 27. But as they brought him for this mock trial, as the soldiers had him under their control, they're beating him, they're spitting upon him. And because of the Jews' claims that this was blasphemy, that he was claiming to be God when he wasn't, they dress him in a purple robe, and they twist together a crown of thorns to set it on him. They're doing this in mocking. This purple cloak that they put on, it's an irony to mock the claims of kinship. And it's interesting that John's gospel fixates and says over and over these claims that this Jesus is King of the Jews. This color was a call to his supposed authority, this Messiah who they expected would be a political leader. And it is ironic that as the crowd chants, crucify him, Pilate is inscribing on the card that would hang on his cross, here is Jesus, King of the Jews. They're actually performing a coronation, although they're intending it to be a humiliation. This garment of jest is placed on the true king. The act of seizing another's robe to claim authority. Some of you who really know your Bible will recall this story of David who's sneaking up behind King Saul to cut a piece of his robe off. It was the practice that if you could claim another king in battle and have victory over him, you would take a piece of his robe, if not the whole robe, and you would stitch it to the hem of yours. And so battle after battle, a king's robe and train would become longer and longer, and it would be a patchwork testimony of the victories won. But here is the great reversal. That instead of seizing a robe to claim authority, Jesus is giving up his, and they're dressing him as a king. And while they mean to strip him of his dignity, the robing actually stands as its own testimony. John continues with this focus, this interest in the garments and the fashion of Jesus. In his gospel, we continue to chapter 19, where we read that when the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 shares, one for each of the soldiers that was standing guard. But the undergarment remained. This particular garment was seamless. It was woven in one piece from top to bottom with just sort of an opening for the head. And they recognized this is a special garment. This is priceless. This was not common. And its value was worth more intact than pulled apart. So they discussed it and said, let's not tear it. Let's decide by casting lots who will get it. At the cross, these soldiers are gambling for Jesus' garment. And humanity is trying to possess what only can God give freely. Things haven't changed much in this world that urges us to take, to divide, to conquer, to compete, to prove ourselves. And even at the foot of the cross, there's humanity just trying to win the game. This is where that garment motif is critical, because Jesus' tunic being worn and woven of one piece is definitely symbolic and a callback to the high priest's garment. We read those instructions in Exodus 28, where it says the high priestly tunic or garment will be woven in one piece, not stitched together. And this, Jesus is demonstrating his connection to the role of being a royal priest. And in the very moment that they're taking this symbol from him is the one that he's performing his most priestly act. Instead of the Levitical priests who are responsible for the lamb sacrifice, this high priest is taking responsibility and bringing himself as a sacrifice. And John says they're doing this to fulfill the prophecy found in Psalm 22. And this is a royal lament of David. And he says, they divided my clothes amongst them and cast lot for my garment. As the king speaks in Psalms, he's crying out, signifying his abandonment, signifying the end of this role that he's to play. It is a pattern, if you read the entire psalm, of building humiliation. And John's story slows down the narrative precisely at this moment to flag something important, that there's a fulfillment of this psalm prophecy, and that soldiers' self-interest is becoming the very instrument for this prophetic precision. John moves through the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, and we come to a final notice, a final detail of what Jesus is wearing. John chapter 20, verses 6 and 7 talks about that special Sunday morning after a day of sorrow and grief, where the disciples make their way to the tomb of Jesus. And John 26 and 7 says that Simon Peter went straight in. He rushed into the tomb, and he saw before him the strips of linen lying there. And the peculiar detail, the cloth that had wrapped Jesus' head was still lying in its place, separate from the other pieces of linen. This resurrection scene is powerful because it reverses the stripping of Jesus to his nakedness. And where those garments had been forcibly taken and distributed, now they're deliberately being left behind. These linen cloths, these strips of fabric that are folded so neatly, so carefully on that tombstone, They have generated for centuries a lot of speculation and reflection. Some theologians will say that this is definitely a signal of intentionality. It's an indication or evidence that the body wasn't stolen and dragged away with bits of linen left, or that the linen would be taken with the body. It's evidence that the body left the grave clothes behind. Others will point to some rabbinical teachings that say the folded cloth is reflective of a rabbi custom that when the master folds his cloth and leaves the table, it's a sign that he intends to return. But regardless of what each meaning or all those meanings combined point to, we know that John establishes the burial cloths are left in order, just as Isaiah promised. For Isaiah 61 tells us that our garments of mourning will be exchanged for garments of praise. And what is left behind in that tomb is a sign of departure and defeat. But not the defeat by death, the defeat of death. This garment thread throughout the narrative points us to Jesus' role as a royal high priest, the one whose robe cannot be cut or torn, like Saul's, like David's, the one who would be dressed in mockery with royal robes by soldiers speaking truth far more profound than they knew. And it's the covering of the one who will leave the tomb and leave those grave clothes behind as he dismisses death. It's the one who Isaiah also has a vision of, whose royal robes end up filling the temple. It's this one who comes to clothe the brokenhearted in praise, to dress those mourning with gladness again, with hope, with joy, with peace. The one who is stripped and dressed for humiliation is going to be the very one taking responsibility as an agent of clothing the ones in need. And so this Easter, the question to you is, if the grave is empty, why are we still wearing grave clothes? Why are we still putting on these feelings, these voices, dressing ourselves with guilt, shame, grief, our self-made identity? Why are we still wearing the fig leaves of addiction when we have the promise of a robe of righteousness, a robe of life, a robe of glory? So the call is, what grave clothes do you need to give up today as you put on Christ, which Paul instructs the Galatians church to do, to be clothed in him, to wear his righteousness, to assume a posture of praise, to lean into that divine purpose that we've been given because Jesus fulfilled his.